Okay, we're running live. So today's Wednesday, February 17, and this is the second lecture for the Human Nature course, Syracuse University, the online version of Human Nature. We'll be talking about the metaphysics of the mind, or the metaphysics of the soul, today. So in at least the Western tradition for a very long time, the term soul, the term mind, have meant at least very closely the same thing. So we can use those terms interchangeably. If we find that there's a problem with doing so, we can go ahead and discuss that as the term proceeds, because we'll continue discussing the nature of the soul. The key question that we're dealing with in this course, you recall from the course introduction from last week, is are we bodies or souls, right? Following Richard Swinburne's book, right? Are we bodies or souls? So this is the primary text for the course, and the course reading began with chapter 2. So hopefully you've had a chance to read some of it, read some of that chapter. What I want to do this time is introduce probably about 2/3 of that chapter, roughly, maybe a bit less. We'll see how things go. Introduce the material there in intuitive terms as much as I can. You know, Swinburne begins with some hyper precision in his discussion of things, but it might be helpful to begin with a bit more intuitive of a discussion, and I'll add a little bit of history in as well. So Swinburne, by and large, ahistorically presents the material, and there might be some help with understanding what's going on with Swinburne by providing just a bit of some historical context. So I'll do that when it comes to thinking about some ancient and what we call modern philosophy. But when we get to the contemporary stuff, I won't be presenting too much of the history there, at least in terms of the key figures, at least not this time. No doubt they'll come up at some point. So what I'll go ahead and do is share my screen and begin the proper presentation. I hope everybody's doing great out there. Thanks for watching. Thanks for coming. Okay, so got a PowerPoint presentation and a whiteboard presentation that I was able to scan some whiteboard sketches and then turn them into a PDF. So anyway, so here's our topic this week: the metaphysics of the soul. Are we bodies or souls? Chapter 2. So we'll be doing a lot of metaphysics in this class, as I've introduced. So remember, metaphysics is that part of philosophy that's concerned with the existence of things, the nature of those existing things. But again, this will be an introduction to chapter 2, where, again, I try to put things in intuitive terms to help out with some of the rigorous precision that we find early on in the Swinburne. We can just continue to get more and more precise as the term goes on, as we learn more philosophy, get more comfortable with the concepts and the terrain, the intellectual terrain that's relevant. So my presentation will be a bit more historical as anticipated, and a bit more intuitive than what we find in the Swinburne. But the hope is that with this presentation, when you go back to read the Swinburne, or you read the Swinburne for the first time, much of it will make more sense. That's the hope. So setting the stage here. So two traditional views, views that go way back in the history of philosophy to our ancient Greek roots, ancient Greek ancestors, Plato and Aristotle. I also include Descartes here. Many of you know Descartes, the philosopher mathematician, from what we call the modern period of philosophy, doing philosophy in the 17th century, the first half of the 17th century dominantly, because he wasn't alive in the second half. But there's the substance dualist view, and then there's the hylomorphic dualism view. So these are both dualistic views, meaning that what's going to account for human nature, what's going to account for the nature of the human being is two things, whether the two things be substances or whether they be a substance and something else that's not a substance. So just initially, like the difference between substance dualism and hylomorphic dualism is just that. The substance dualist is going to claim that when you think about the human being, there are two parts, two substances that make up the human being. One part is going to be essential. The other part won't be essential to what we are, at least that's a traditional way of understanding the substance dualist view as held by Plato and Descartes. The hylomorphic view maintains that human beings are bodies, but we also have a soul, but the soul isn't to be understood as a distinct substance, right, in its own right. It's the form of the body, as it were. Okay, so when you look at the word hylomorphic here, be thinking hylo, body, and then morphic, form. So the body form view. Substance dualist view is the body soul distinct substance view, distinct substances view. Okay, so going to my whiteboard here just to help out. Here might be a way of diagramming, in a very rudimentary way, what substance dualism amounts to. So here's the human being, and then the bodily part of the human being is easy enough to represent using images. But work with me when I try to capture the soul, at least the traditional idea of the soul, which involves the notion of immateriality, or involves immateriality, right? I just use a circle to represent the soul as a substance, in this case, as a thing in its own right. If souls are immaterial, it might be impossible to represent them using images, okay? So obviously I'm asking for you to work with me here. This is just to capture the idea that the substance dualist wants to maintain that there's body and there's soul, or there's body and there's mind. And those are distinct substances. The body is a material substance, no surprise there. And the soul or the mind is an immaterial substance. Okay, so keep in mind that that many, at least in the modern period, going back roughly to the 16th, 17th centuries to contemporary times, philosophers have used the term soul and body to mean roughly the same thing. Okay, there are questions about the ancients and their use of the terms, soul and mind, but the term for soul, I think, was suke, which means psyche, which, translated, just means psychology or mind. So that's part of the reason why we've seen developed in the modern and the contemporary, or through the contemporary times, the use of mind, the use of the term mind, and the use of the term soul, right, to denote or to refer to the same entities, the same entity, singular, in the world. Supposing there is such a thing, of course, which we ordinarily take there to be, right? So anyways, this is a way of capturing, the substance dualist view, right, as held by Plato and Descartes. And this might be something like a very commonsensical view, a view that you would still find pretty prevalently held in the world even to this day. Okay, those with theological beliefs, religious beliefs, may incline towards this view, especially those who are part of religious traditions that are Western or are monotheistic, part of the Abrahamic tradition. So the Jewish, the Christian, and the Muslim traditions, they all dominantly have something like a substance dualist view, advocated at least by many of their prominent theologians. And at the end of the day, this is Swinburne's view. It's just going to be that as substance dualists maintain, typically, historically, they maintain that that the soul is what we essentially are. So we're essentially the soul, and the body, even though we have a body, it's not what we essentially are. So there's a sense in which these can come. There's a sense in which then these can come apart from each other, even if it's true to maintain that the natural, or the quote unquote natural location, quote unquote location of a material object like a soul is a body, right? So there are some substance dualists who will maintain that, oh yeah, of course the soul can exist independent of the body, but they'll go on to further say something like the soul, its most natural location, quote unquote, is in a body, or paired with a body, however that works out, okay, metaphysically. Okay, so these are just two traditional views. We got the substance dualism view, now the hylomorphic view, just so you get a sense of what that looks like. Diagrammed it out. So hylomorphic dualism, Aristotelian dualism would be fine. So this is the view that Aristotle held as he broke away from his teacher Plato holding the substance dualism view. And so here we have the human being once again, and I'm just trying to tease out the various parts of the human being, the body and the soul. And the hylomorphic dualist maintains that we've got the body, and the body is a material substance, and the soul is a form of the body. And so now you might be like wondering, well, what does it mean for something to count as a form of the body? And there are debates about this. There's interpretive debate about this. Maybe the most helpful thing to say at this point would be this. So for someone like Aristotle, who developed this view, is known as really the ancient ancestor of this view, that still is held to this day by various philosophers, Aristotelian metaphysicians, if I can put it that way. What they would claim is that think about the different kinds of material objects that there are. So kinds is an important term here. So we have we have plants, that's a kind of material object. We have animals, there's another kind of material object. Then there's human beings, another kind of material objects. But of course, there are also inanimate things. So the first three examples, they're all examples of animate things, or living things, if I could put it that way. And but they're also inanimate objects. Rocks would be the paradigmatic example there. You might think that artifacts count as inanimate objects. So we make pencils and pens and tables and chairs, right, out of living things, and then they become non-living inanimate objects. So we have these different kinds of physical things, two of which were inanimate, and the three first, they were animate. Well, among just thinking about the animate objects, so plants, animals, and humans, there's something that organizes the matter in the way in which it's organized to make these different things the kinds of things that they are in the first place. So there's the form of plant, there's the form of animal, and there's the form of human being. Okay, and so the hylomorphic dualist about human nature is saying that we, like other living things, have a form that makes us the kind of living thing that we are. If you go back to Aristotle, the thing that really distinguishes us from other living things is the fact that we have a rational form. We have a soul that is rational, that has rationality as a part of it. So human reason, or reason, is the thing that distinguishes ultimately from animals and also plants. So you can think about forms as sort of these organizing principles, and there's different kinds of organizing principles corresponding to the different kind of material object something is. So that's hylomorphic dualism. Hylo might be thinking about, the matter and the morphic form, or the morphology of the matter, the way in which the matter is formed. Aristotelian dualism. Okay, so two traditional views here developed. So there's, Plato, right, on our, left here, and then Aristotle on our right. And, they had different metaphysics. They're very close in terms of their philosophies, but there's these important splinterings that occurred that then affected quite a bit of the rest of the history of philosophy accordingly. Okay, so remember, right, Plato, he's more otherworldly in his thinking about things, and in terms of his metaphysics, in terms of his epistemology, his theory, and his account of knowledge. And Aristotle, there he is gesturing downward. He's more worldly based. He's more empiricistic, more, grounded in his thinking about things in empirical matters. Aristotle is one of the greatest scientists of all time as well. He started his own school. He broke, away from the academy after studying with Plato. He went back to his homeland in Macedonia to tutor Alexander, who'd become Alexander the Great. And then after that stint, he went back to Athens and formed his own school called the Lyceum, and he did all kinds of science. Okay, he was a major classifier. He loved to classify things, but he's very much more empirically minded compared to Plato, and it shows, right, in his even thinking about human nature. Okay. Okay, let me get to just the next whiteboard ready to go. We're going to segue to this in a second. So, go again. Plato and Aristotle. This is from that school of Athens painting. This is the very center of it, the Raphael painting. Okay, I mentioned René Descartes. We're going to talk about Descartes more in chapter 4 when we get to that chapter in the Swinburne. But those are his dates. As I mentioned, 17th century philosopher. I say he lived into the second half of the 17th century. He died right at 1650. He was a French philosopher and mathematician. You may have heard of the Cartesian coordinates. You may have heard of algebraic geometry. Well, René Descartes, he discovered those, perhaps discovered / invented those, depending on how you think about mathematical matters. He's known for his substance dualism. Okay, so if you know anything about Descartes, you may know about his methodological skepticism that he invokes in a work called The Meditations on First Philosophy. So he ends up developing a kind of methodological doubt in order to see if he can arrive at a proposition that he can know with certainty, on which to base all human knowledge on. And he ends up claiming that he can doubt everything that his senses tell him, because he could always be dreaming when he thinks he's awake. So he has this famous dream argument that he actually, redevelops. It was an ancient argument, developed at least by the ancient philosopher St. Augustine. But he develops this famous dream argument, which in effect has it that he can doubt every single one of his sense beliefs. So if that's the case, then he can doubt the existence of his own body, because we come to know bodily things, don't we, through our senses. So if every one of our sense beliefs, including our bodily beliefs, our own personal bodily beliefs, can be doubted, then obviously those beliefs don't attain to certainty. And remember, he's looking for a proposition that's immune from doubt, a proposition that is absolutely certain. And he ends up claiming that he can doubt just about every other proposition, because no matter what, he could be deceived by an evil demon. There could be an evil demon that makes him believe certain things, but across the board, every one of his beliefs turns out to be false. or at least possibly false. And that's enough to cast doubt on the proposition in question, and thus eliminate it from counting as certain. Well, he eventually, in book 2 of his meditations, or meditation 2 of his meditations on first philosophy, ends up claiming, well, no matter how much I'd be deceived, by an evil demon, he couldn't deceive me about the fact that I'm thinking, right? Because in order to be deceived, right, you have to be engaged in thought and thinking. And guess what? If I'm thinking, right, if anyone is thinking or anything is thinking, then that thing or that individual exists. So Descartes is able to conclude famously, I think, I am. Or sometimes it's put more popularly as I think, therefore I am. Okay, so that's where the I think, therefore I am comes from, right? However much you would try to deceive Descartes, however much an evil demon could deceive you as you imagine you're sort of Descartes in these meditations, that evil demon couldn't deceive you about your thinking and about then your existence. Okay, insofar as you're thinking, right, you've got to exist. That's the idea. So I'm sure you've heard of that before. And he ends up running a kind of argument that we'll talk about when we get to chapter 4 for substance dualism, at least in part based on the idea that his body, right, has the property of being like doubted, right? It has a property of possibly not existing, right? Insofar as he's thinking, but he doesn't have that property, right? Or I think about it in the first person. I don't have the property of possibly not existing insofar as I'm thinking, because insofar as I'm thinking, I must exist. And that difference in properties establishes a difference in thing. So I am not my body. Now, at least that's one interpretation of the argument, and Swinburne's going to discuss that in chapter 4. So I've given you kind of a sketch of the way the argument is commonly interpreted, and Swinburne will have a discussion about that. So we'll hang tight on that. That's just a basic idea. He's rationalist in his thinking, like Plato was. He did think that we can, Descartes did think that we can have knowledge from our senses ultimately, but ultimately we can also have knowledge. We do have knowledge from the use of our reason alone. Arriving at the claim that I know that I exist, right, is a rationalist claim. It's rationalist knowledge to arrive at that, because it can be done just purely by thinking, purely through the use of one's reason. Okay, so that's Descartes. Okay, and much of the contemporary, philosophy of the mind, metaphysics of the mind, will oftentimes begin with thinking about Descartes and what Descartes claimed and his arguments for his positions, and then philosophers go from there. Okay, so then there are two materialist views that I'll briefly discuss. So views which would have it that the mind just is the body, or the view of the human person, the view of the self, the view of what we essentially are, is that we're material objects, we're bodily, okay, or some such, right? Some part of the body, etc. So an ancient view of materialism would be Epicurean atomism after the philosopher Epicurus. And then a modern materialism would be Hobbesian mechanistic materialism. So the modern period, Hobbes was writing in the generations in which Descartes was, roughly. He lived a bit longer. I think he was born a bit earlier. But anyways, these are just two, materialist views, which are in some ways precursors to the prominent contemporary view, which is by and large a materialistic view of human nature, materialistic view of the human being. So here's Epicurus's view. So Epicurus is writing in the generations right after Aristotle. So we're thinking 4th and 3rd century BCE. Plato writing in the 4th century, BCE, of course. So So the human being is divided into the material object and the soul. So the body and the soul, where the body is understood as a material object and the soul is understood also as a material object. And Epicurus is trying to capture the idea that, right, the soul doesn't seem to be as weighty, right, as the the other larger parts of our body. Like the muscle, the fat, the skeleton that we walk around in. So the body is a heavier material object, the soul a lighter material object. And as I noted, Epicurus's view is a kind of atomism. So there was an ancient Greek view called atomism. So that had it that everything that exists is either an atom or a collection of atoms. So it's kind of an interesting view because they didn't have like the telescopic or the microscopic technology, right, in order to know about these very, very tiny particles that we know about nowadays. But atom just means, literally, when we think about the ancient Greek word for atom, it just means something like indivisible. So atoms are basically these indivisible objects, indivisible material objects. Sometimes they're called simple because they don't have any parts. They don't subdivide it into further parts. That's what it means to be subdivisible. So according to the atomist position, everything that exists, again, is either an atom, so it's an indivisible object, or it's a collection of those indivisible objects. And Epicurus was influenced by the atomists. The most famous of the atomists was Democritus. But Epicurus, he ended up getting influenced quite a bit by Democritus and developed an atomistic view of the human being. So the body were just collections of these atoms. The soul were collections of these atoms. And you guessed it, the body, according to Epicurus, is going to be a collection of the heavier atoms, and then the soul is going to be a collection of the lighter atoms. And what Epicurus believed is that what happens at death, that's a permanent end of existence. So once the collection of atoms dissolves sufficiently, once the collection of lighter atoms dissolve, they break apart, decompose, right? That soul object decomposes. That's the end of existence. That's a permanent end of our existence. So Epicurus broke away from an ancient view that the soul is the thing that reincarnates after this life, and so there's some kind of life after death. It's an afterlife. Okay, and then there's the Hobbesian mechanistic materialism. So this is a different materialistic view. Hobbes, in the modern period, he wanted to develop a philosophy that was empirically minded, rigorously scientifically minded. So think about the modern period, the rise of the modern period. We have the rise of the new science. We have figures like Copernicus and Galileo. Galileo being a really huge figure here. And with the rise of the new science and the success that we found in the new sciences, Copernicus and Galileo on, right, we found philosophers trying to develop more scientific philosophical worldviews. Okay, much in the same way that Epicurus was influenced by Democritus and these ancient figures who were in their time more scientifically minded and thinking about the world and developing worldviews. So when Hobbes understood, when he theorized, about the human person, right, about the human being, he said, well, just like every other thing that exists materially, the human being is a material object, and it's mechanistically a material object. So there was this view that started developing about the nature of the universe in Hobbes's day, and it was that the universe is a giant machine, and everything within the object is machine-like as well. So that's where you get the mechanistic aspects, the materialism here. And so the human being is also a machine. It's just a more complicated machine, you see? So there's all these different kinds of living things. So the mechanistic, philosophers during this time period had an issue with dealing with living things, which didn't seem to be purely, mechanistic, as did, things like, watches and other, mechanical things that were around during that time period, watches or clocks, maybe more accurately. And what Hobbes ends up claiming is, well, it's got to be the case that these living things, they're more complex in terms of their mechanistic arrangements. Okay. There were other, materialistic views that maintain that, human beings or living things or organisms, they're living things that weren't reducible to, machine-like things, but they're still physical. Okay. Or they say were at least quasi-physical, physicalist or materialist views about human nature, right? About living things more generally. Okay. Here's Hobbes's view. So we've got a modern version of materialism, the human being a material object, and the soul is a material object. He doesn't make any claims about the soul being, constituted by lighter material objects, etc. So basically, I have body plus soul here, but these are just material objects. I have two things on, two items, depicted here on the whiteboard, but strictly speaking, there's one thing here. Okay. And so we should understand the soul as being, one with the body that we have. So, I could have just put here an equal sign between the two of them, right? So, because body is a soul and the soul is body, there's the same thing. So a materialist view, like the one developed by Epicurus and the one developed by Hobbes, is really a monistic view. It breaks away from the dualism of philosophers like Plato, Aristotle, and Descartes, as we've talked about. So so one could be dualistic about the human being in the ways described, but one can also be monistic, meaning there's only one thing, right, ultimately that is needed to account for what the human being is. And for Epicurus and Hobbes, this is the body. Of course, like in logical space, one could say there's more than two things, right? So one could be a pluralist about the human being. Okay, one might say that the soul and the mind are distinct things. One might say the soul, the mind, and the will are distinct things, and there's a body, so there's four things. In logical space, one can develop such views. As just a kind of a tendency in philosophy, just as in the sciences, there's a tendency to try to account for the relevant phenomenon that one is theorizing about in as few entities as possible. So that's one of the reasons why philosophers tend to go either monist or dualist, and not beyond that. At least not typically. There's nothing nothing in principle stops a philosopher from going further in that regard, thinking about human nature. Okay. Any questions or comments? Well, here's an image of Descartes, and he's here depicted side by side with Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia. So this is someone who he was in correspondence with. She was really interested in the new science and the new philosophy, interested in Descartes' philosophy. So you have to think, like, when Descartes was developing his view, we had the rise of the new science. Okay, we had the rise of Copernicus and Galileo. There were major shifts in the world, in our worldview back then, and there was, due to the successes of the new sciences, especially the success of Galileo, there was a pressure to develop philosophies that were scientific, or at least more scientific. And Descartes wanted to do that. He wanted to develop views that were scientifically respectable and all the rest. But he wanted to hang on to like traditional ideas in philosophy, in metaphysics, like the idea that that God is in connection with the world in relation to the world. The universe isn't just a giant machine that's operating at the guidance of the physical laws, right? Very general physical laws. But there was a God that could intervene in the physical world. That there was a soul, the human mind or a human soul, that could interact with the body, and the body can interact with the mind. There was a two-way relationship between the two, and that we were free, and our freedom required that we weren't governed by physical laws. Okay, and we weren't governed by the fact that we weren't governed by physical laws, explained by the fact that there's a part of us that isn't physical, right? The essential part of us isn't physical. So Descartes was and has been deemed one of these really crucial figures, because you have the rise of the new science, but here he is trying to, at the same time, consistently incorporate very traditional ideas, many of them being religious. So Descartes, at least on the face of it, was committed to very general Christian theological ideas, which he thought implied, at the very least, or otherwise were best supported by dualistic claims about human nature, and God being able to interact in the physical world, us having free will, the kind of free will that requires not being determined, etc., determined by physical laws. So there were some philosophers back then who said, "Oh, I want to account for the existence of God and the existence of the soul and the existence of free will." But what they would do is they would revise certain aspects of the concepts that were traditionally had traditionally held or had been developed in certain kinds of ways. So Hobbes, for example, was someone who would be like, we're going to understand the soul in physical terms. We're going to understand free will as being perfectly consistent with being determined by mechanistic laws, and we'll understand God as a physical being, and that's how God can interact in the physical world. Okay. But many during that time thought that those ideas were dangerous, and at the very least they were heretical, and went against long-standing theological / metaphysical beliefs. Okay, so on this slide here, I have the interaction problem noted. So here's the Cartesian dualist view, Descartes' dualism. We just call it Cartesian often, just like we call the some of his mathematical innovations Cartesian. So on his view, there's the material substance that interacts with an immaterial substance. The mind or the soul interacts with the body. Okay, and Descartes did end up claiming, that's why gesturing up here is very natural to do that. He ended up claiming that the immaterial soul, the immaterial mind, there was a certain point of interaction at the pineal gland with the brain, and then the brain obviously is connected to the rest of the body. So we have material substance interacting with an immaterial substance, and there's a symmetrical causal relation or interaction between the two. So the body causally interacts with the soul, and the soul causally interacts with the body. Okay, so the body. Imagine a case where a really easy case where the human being in question here stubs their toe, right? That causally brings about soul states of pain, mental states of pain, and then mental states of pain or soul states of pain lead to other bodily things like saying ouch, taking aspirin, and then the taking of aspirin in turn causes the pain to be alleviated. You see how this works? A symmetrical causal relationship between the body and the soul, these distinct substances. So we say that the causal relation is symmetrical in that regard. But now here's the question. The interaction problem question is, how do body and soul causally interact with each other? I mean, how does something immaterial interact with something material? Maybe an easy way of thinking about this is it seems that causal interaction requires a spatial connection, but something immaterial isn't spatially located. So it couldn't come in spatial contact with something bodily. And so Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia, in her correspondence with Descartes, raises this problem to his view. And Descartes didn't really have a satisfactory answer. He discusses the pineal gland in some of his works, and his response is basically to say that it's just a basic fact that that immaterial things can interact with material things. You could have cited, as some philosophers do, that there's no problem in principle with this because God is an immaterial spiritual thing, interacts with physical creation, whatever God wants, et cetera, et cetera. So there's no in principle problem with that. But of course, you can run the interaction problem with respect to God's relationship to the created world, or God as understood as an immaterial substance, spiritual substance, interacting with something purely or something that's physical. So how do body and soul causally interact with each other, right, given that they're so radically different? And the easy way of understanding this problem that emerges from thinking about this question is, it seems that causal connection requires maybe spatial relations between objects that are causally related, or spatial temporal relations that are between objects that are spatially related. Of course, if we go with some of the contemporary science on this, then if we're talking about something spatial, we're talking about something temporal, given the inextricable connection between space and time. So here I'm thinking about the innovations of Einstein. Okay. So that's the interaction problem. A very, very, very important problem in the history of thinking about the metaphysics of the mind, the metaphysics of the soul, especially for those who want to claim that that the soul, the body are distinct substances, radically distinct substances that are causally related with each other. Okay, so here's one solution to that problem. So one way I like to think about what's going on in chapter 2 of the Swinburne, I hope a helpful way of thinking about it is that he gives us a bit of a snippet of some of the important developments in dealing with the interaction problem. It's just that I'm going to say a bit more than he does in the text to set things up. He kind of more or less jumps to the materialist solution. I just wanted to do some historical background, as I've already done, and I'm still working on that. We got to the interaction problem, which is such an important problem for thinking about the metaphysics of the mind and the soul. I want to offer another solution that was developed in the history of philosophy that may intrigue you, may interest you, and get you thinking. There's the idealism solution. So according to this solution, we have body and soul. And what I did here, instead of just putting a plus sign, I put an equal sign, right? Because the body on this view just is something soulful. It just is something mental, if I can put it that way. So remember, the soul and mind, they're oftentimes those terms are understood to just mean the same thing, or at the very least to refer to the same thing. So on this view, material substances just are immaterial ones. So it could be that there's different ways that this gets developed. It could be that the things that we take to be material, like tables, chairs, trees, physical human bodies, it could be that those things are taken to be immaterial substances, or they could be taken to be just collections of ideas or something like that. Ideas, obviously, they're mental things as well. So, here I'm just kind of getting the general idea out there. Material substances just are immaterial ones. So this is just a general idealism solution. The idealism solution can take different forms. One form it could take is just that, like material properties or material things, where we just get rid of the idea of substance for a moment here. So that's a loaded philosophical term that I haven't really got into yet. Just our immaterial things, or just our, and the relevant immaterial things that they could be are just ideas, ideas being immaterial things as well. So this is probably as good time as any to say a couple of words about what substances are, given that I've just been kind of taking it for granted, what it means. A substance is the object, or if you think about a substance, you think about an object generally that has a kind of independent existence from other substances, and in which properties exist or find their inherent, sometimes is put. So this is a view that goes back to Aristotle. It's called a substance property ontology, a substance property metaphysics, whereby we think about the most fundamentally existing things, the ultimate existing things. If you're Aristotle, you say, oh, they're the substances, and the substances have properties. So this marker is a substance, and it has properties. The property of having a lid that's black, a property of having ink that's black. It has a white body, right? So this is a substance. It has properties. Likewise, think about maybe the example of like living things. This would be an example of an artifact, obviously, but think about the property had by your dog or your cat or your pet more generally, right? It's a substance, but it also has various properties. It has property maybe being a cat, property being a dog, property being a goldfish, and it has other properties, maybe property, so think about how they have different colors, they have different masses, and all the rest. And so a substance is sort of this unifying thing in which properties find their existence or their inherence. Okay. So a substance property ontology, where we understand substances as the objects, and then we understand objects as having properties. Okay, properties and objects. They're at least conceptually distinct things, even if every object is such that it always has some properties or other, right? So there's never just a bare existing object without any properties whatsoever existing. Okay. Now I note this just because there are some versions of idealism which deny the existence of substances altogether. They just say that, well, we're going to understand by body just properties, collections of properties. They just think we can do away with this underlying unifying thing in which the properties adhere, and just say they're just bodies or material objects, just are property collections of properties. We don't need anything to sort of unify the set of properties. And then the same thing would be true. And then if you're going to go idealist, you're going to say, okay, well, those properties, those collections of properties, right, that we're going to call bodies, those are just ultimately, right, immaterial things, immaterial properties, or ideas or some such. So so I just kind of, on this slide, or on this whiteboard presentation, I just use substance for simplicity's sake, but one can go idealist in a different way, denying the existence of substances. So the substance property ontology that we get from Aristotle, that Swinburne, right, endorses in his work, is one that some philosophers have rejected. They say we don't need substances; properties are enough. Okay. So as I got to this slide and then moved away quickly, but Bishop Berkeley, someone who developed an idealism, a version of idealism, right? So he's someone who developed idealism for various reasons, but one reason, at least that's traditionally attributed to him, is the fact that, look, in part he's responding to the mind-body problem, or the interaction problem with, if we think about the mind and body as these, radically distinct substances, right? Material and immaterial substances, right, in their own rights. So Berkeley is someone who developed, he's an Irish philosopher, he's a bishop, so he's in the Christian tradition as a bishop, but he developed a version of idealism. he denied also the existence of substances. So that's the reason why I kind of went to great lengths just a moment ago in talking about this. So he's someone who denied the existence of substances. So he said that, you know, the material objects that we bump into, that we observe with our senses, those things are just collections of properties. And then he went on to say, well, those properties are they're just all mental things. They're just all ideas. There's collections of ideas. So for him, Berkeley, material objects just are mental things. They're all the mental things they are. They're collections of mental properties or collections of ideas. So he's an idealist in that regard. That's one way of going with respect to dealing with the interaction problem. Is you avoid the interaction problem by going this route, because you just reduce the material objects to immaterial objects, mental objects, and you don't have to worry about the interaction of two radically distinct things. In a way, you just kind of eliminated, right, one of the two things that were supposed to be causally related. Okay, that we couldn't see how they're causally related because they were so radically distinct. Well, just say, well, they're both the same thing. Okay, and so there's no problem with an immaterial object interacting with another immaterial object. The problem comes when we think about the interaction of two distinct, radically distinct kinds of objects. And Berkeley's famous for developing something like this slogan. At least he's traditionally claimed to have espoused a principle like this: to be is to be perceived. Sometimes idealism gets understood in terms of this slogan. There are various kinds of idealism that are developed that are developed in line with this slogan, to be is to be perceived. You might be wondering, well, gosh, I'm not currently perceiving my car in the garage, so does that mean that my car doesn't exist? And for that concern and all other concerns like it, Berkeley says, no worries, God exists. He gives arguments for God's existence. And he says, no worries, God exists, and God is the master perceiver. God perceives everything. And by perceiving everything, God keeps everything in existence. And the concern would be if God stopped thinking about it. If God stopped thinking about it, then it's no more. Okay. So you probably have heard of that slogan at some point or other in your lives. I just wanted to round things out with Thomas Hobbes here. So those are his dates, not 1855, 16. No, he was 15. 15. What are his years? 15. I'll just do. I'll fix it. I don't know exactly. I know he lived a long life. He lived like almost 90 years. So 15. It's like 70 or so. I'll just do that and fix it later. So he lived a very, very long life. As I said, almost 90 years. Yeah, he's a materialist. He's an empiricist. So what it means to be an empiricist, in case that isn't clear, I've anticipated what it means a couple of times already. It just means that knowledge is based on sense experience. It's a more scientific way of developing an account of knowledge. We come to know knowledge primarily, fundamentally, through the use of our senses, our sense experiences. You see how that would be in line with like the scientific method, right? The method of observation, etc. Oh, 1588. Okay. Okay, so I must have got this last part wrong. It's not 1689, it's 1679, right? 1580 to 1679. I think that's what it is. Thanks for catching that for me, Chris. Let me know if I didn't get that second part right, the 1679 part right.
That's correct.
It is right. Okay, thank you. Okay, so that's the PowerPoint presentation. I'm going to say more. Hopefully I capture this, but yeah, he's famous for this matter in motion slogan. So this captures his being influenced by Galileo. Remember Galileo giving us these laws of motion and these very general laws associated with motion. And so Hobbes, there he is trying to incorporate some of that scientific worldview, into his philosophy. There's so much more that we can say about Hobbes that's very interesting, but let's move on. Okay. Okay, so here's the general materialism solution. So we have body and the soul being the same thing, or the soul being the body. Typically, the material solution involves trying to define what the soul is, what the mind is, in terms of something bodily, right? So usually the emphasis is on moving from, in this case, moving from the right to the left with that equal sign, or identity sign, more accurately. So the material solution is that the body and the soul, they're both material objects. The soul, which equals the mind, just is a material object. Maybe it's a brain, a part of the brain, okay, or some such. So that's the materialism solution. So really, at the beginning of the 20th century, thereabouts, we find that philosophers are a bit sick of efforts to go idealist in their solution to the interaction problem. And so they say a more scientific way of going is the materialist route. And this view gains quite a bit of ascendancy, quite a bit of primacy in the 20th century, first part of the 20th century and thereafter. And really, it's continued to this day, just various versions of it have developed, as Swinburne discusses in chapter 2. Another route that philosophers went, and behaviorism is discussed in the Swinburne as well, is the behaviorism route. So you've got the body and you have the mind, or you have bodily events and we have mental events. So we understand the mind in terms of these mental events. And the behaviorism solutions claims that mental events just are bodily behaviors. So that's if the behaviorist is making a metaphysical claim, which some behaviorists did. So the behaviorist, or one kind of behaviorist, the metaphysical behaviorist, would say, look, it's not empirical enough, to follow, psychologists like Freud and posit these inner ghostly-like entities inside the human brain or near the human brain or some such, right? It's not empirical enough. So they thought that it'd be an interesting research project to begin with the metaphysical presupposition that the mind just is reducible to sets of physical behaviors. So that was the that's one way of going behaviorist. Another way of going behaviorist is just to deny, or just to bracket the metaphysical problem and say, like, look, if we're going to understand what the mind is, we have to understand the mind empirically. So we'll just go ahead and bracket the metaphysical question, push forward, and deal with the mind as something, or mental events, more specifically in terms of behavioral items. So the behaviorist solution didn't always involve making robust metaphysical claims, though there's nothing that stops some of them from doing so. It's just that some didn't want to engage in the metaphysics because they thought that studying the mind was doing science, and science is not a part of philosophy. It's not a part of a part of metaphysics, and so different methodologies were required to understand the mind, or to understand mental events. Okay. Another related kind of behaviorist view that's out there, sometimes it's called the analytic behaviorism. That's what Swinburne calls it, and others have called it that as well. And what they do is they attempt to take mental talk, mental language that's been around forever, obviously, and they tried to find a way of taking mental talk and reducing it to behavioral talk. Okay, so they thought that it was a very important sort of conceptual or linguistic conceptual project to translate, if I could put it that way, ordinary folk, mental language, perhaps more generally, mental, concepts, the conceptual framework that we have for, discussing things mental, like being in pains and having beliefs and desires and all the rest, and understanding and translating those linguistic conceptual items, right? Terms and sentences, et cetera, or concepts in terms of behavioral terms and sentences and concepts, et cetera, right? So that was one other kind of behaviorism that's just worth mentioning here. Okay. It's sort of like a linguistic conceptual project, and the thought is if that can be if that project could be carried out, then that would lend some credence to a broader behaviorist project or solution being correct. Like thinking about the mind, thinking about mental events, etc. Okay, so there are issues, though, as you can imagine, with behaviorism. One problem is just that it does seem, doesn't it, that that someone could hide one's mental events, right? So one could, perhaps fake, being in certain mental states. So someone might, be wincing or acting like they're in pain. So their behavior, on a behaviorist view, would suggest that that they're in the mental state of being in pain, but they're not actually, they're faking it. So these sort of fakery type cases pose a serious problem for the behaviorist solution to the mind, the behaviorist solution to thinking about the nature or how to even just deal with the problem of mental events in the scientific realm. So in scientific theorizing. So anyways, behaviorism, it was on the map for a little while, but for reasons related to, at least in part related to the fact that people could behave in various ways as if they were in mental states, but without being in those mental states, gave us reason to think that the behavioral solution was imperfect. So instead of going idealist, instead of going, back to, perhaps a substance dualism view, materialism just continued to develop in the 20th century. And so a material solution that came on the heels of the behaviorism solution is known as type identity theory. And this is discussed in chapter 2 of the Swinburne as well. And so here, the idea is just that when we think about, body events or brain events, right, that, we have as human beings, but we also then think about the fact that we have mental events, like genuine mental events that just aren't reducible to behaviors, as the behaviorists may have thought, at least some stripes of behaviorists thought. We need to give a proper account to those mental events, and the perhaps most viable way of accounting for the mental events is in terms of the body events, or in terms of the BEs or the brain events. So you can understand, BEs as either body events or brain events. The type identity theorists did tend to focus on brain events here, because it does seem like if there's anywhere in the body where mental events are located, it would be in the brain. So on this view, types of mental events are just types of brain events. Okay, so types of mental events just are types of brain events. Why the significance on types? Well, it seems more like rigorously scientific to try to find kinds of things. So think about how, like in science, we wanted to know what the type water is, right? We don't want to know just what, like, what the water coming out of my faucet is. We wanted to know what the very type water is. So we want to know what it is in more general terms. And so we want to know what every single instance, as it were, of water has, what it has in common that makes it water in the first place. So the very same thing would be true for mental events. Is we want to know, like, if we have the type of mental event like pain, we want to know like what every pain, right, has in common, such that it is pain. Or if we think about having a belief as a kind of mental event, we want to know what the type of having a belief, right, is across the board in every possible or every circumstance. And so that's the significance of the type and type identity theory. So we have types of mental events, right? We have pains, beliefs, desires, hopes, wishes, willings, right? Doubtings, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. And the material solution here is to try to figure out, right, what it, like the essence, as it were, of what the essence type is, as it were, of these types of mental events, what they are. And presumably, the answer is going to be found in a certain type of thing. Just like in the water case, the solution to the question as to what type of physical thing water is, right? It's like that type is identical to the type H2O, right? So every instance of water is going to have H2O in common. So we can generalize and say the type water, the type of physical thing water, is identical to the type of physical thing H2O. Okay. As we reduce, water to its, chemical composition in a type way, or in a type kind of way. But yeah, type way as well, right? Because we're taking a type and identifying it with a type. Okay. So that's the type identity theory view, the type identity theory. So we're talking about types and types being identical here. So the example I give is the one involving pain. So this is just a type identity theory. Everything's the same except for this bottom pit here in the blue. So the pain, we might say, as a type of thing, just by hypothesis, that's identical to type-wise to C fibers firing. Okay. And this C fibers firing option is just an example of a brain event. And we're just using it as just an example to show how the theory works. So it might be that belief is going to be identical to D fibers firing. Joy is identical to some other type of brain event, right? Some other type of fiber firing, okay, in the brain. And there you have it. So that's how the theory works. Very scientifically rigorous view. Okay, but the problem with this view, and this is something again that Swinburne discusses in chapter 2. The problem with this kind of view is the problem of multiple realizability, as he calls it, for good reason. The idea here is just that it's plenty imaginable, isn't it? That or conceivable more generally, it's plenty imaginable, plenty conceivable that that an entity be in pain or be in a state of pain, yet not have C fibers, not let alone have C fibers firing. Okay, so there might be other living things, sentient beings that experience pain, but just don't have C fibers firing. So the idea here is that pain, right, as a type of thing, is something that is multiply realizable. Okay, so we're not going to be able to, as it were, at least according to the objection here, we're not going to be able to find a type of brain event that is identical with the relevant type of mental event. Okay, there might even be plenty conceivable, which seems to be that there be sentient beings, just in like logical space here, that feel pain but don't even have brains. So then one of the original challenges, one of the original formulations of the multiple realizability objection here is just an example of a being that feels pain but doesn't have brain, but has purple goo in the brain. It has purple goo in its head or something like that. It doesn't have brain. I just stipulated that. So keep that in mind. That's just like obviously something that in logical space that we can conceive. No matter though, it just seems like we can imagine, or it's conceivable that there be an entity or entities that experience pain without C fibers firing, or without even having brains, more generally. So the type identity theory really struggles. So that led to the rise of what's called token identity theory. So Swinburne doesn't talk about this in his chapter, but this was the natural move after the multiple realizability objection, was to token identity theory. So we have body events, brain events, we have mental events, and how we're going to define mental events token-wise as opposed to type-wise is going to be in terms of tokens of brain events. So you might be wondering what's going on here. What does token mean? Well, if you think about types, those are very general things. And then examples of or instances of the types, they're tokens. So here's a way of thinking about the difference. Let's use pain again. So pain is a type. So I can be in pain, you can be in pain, and we share the type being in pain. Okay, say right now, for example, right? We both have headaches or something, okay? Now, so there's the general type that we share, that we have in common, but there's also the tokens. There's my instance of pain, my headache, and then there's your instance of pain, your headache, okay? So tokens are the particular instances or examples of the types. And so this materialism solution goes token identity. So every token mental event, so my being in pain, your being in pain, is going to be reducible to, claiming to be identical with, a token of a brain event, or perhaps even just more broadly, a body event, something bodily, something material, supposing that a token of a mental event doesn't require having, right, a brain, just for argument's sake. We want to just go more general. So that's a way of thinking about the token identity theory. I give an example on the next, not slide, but next image from my whiteboard. This one's a little blurry, sorry about that. Everything's the same except for here. So pain 1, pain 2, pain 3, pain to the n. So pain 1, let that be my pain, my current headache. Pain 2 be your current headache. Pain 3 being, someone else's toothache, et cetera, et cetera. And we just go on and on, listing off every single one of them. It's identical with C fibers firing, or D fibers firing, or body or brain event 3, or body or brain event 4, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the idea here is perhaps my pain is identical with my C fibers firing, right? Perhaps your pain is identical with your D fibers firing, and perhaps pain 3, someone else's toothache is going to be identical with, explained by some other brain event 3, as I just have listed here. And then suppose some other things pain, right? Doesn't even involve having a brain. Just imagine having some kind of body, right? Where there's something perhaps brain-like, but it's not a brain, right? That'd be BE4 here, okay? But you end up with this massive disjunction, X or Y or Z. So C fibers firing, or D fibers firing, or, right? So we end up with this massive disjunction of, of tokens of body events or brain events, etc. Okay. So some, even though they would endorse such a view, came to see that it's problematic because, at least according to some, this view just isn't properly scientific, right? Like when we tried to figure out what water was, we wouldn't have been content with water's H2O, water's H2O or H3O or H4O or H5O, right? I mean, those are just like, possibilities that may not even make sense, but I think you get the point. So there's something that sort of that goes against the scientific spirit in trying to figure out, what something is, when we end up with this massive disjunction of possibilities of what corresponding with the relevant tokens. In this case, we're talking about tokens of pain, but if we're talking about tokens of water, it doesn't seem very scientific, right? To end up with a long list of things or that correspond with the various tokens of water, right? The scientific explanations seem to need to get to some level of generality. So for that reason, at least in part for that reason, even though the multiple realizability issue has been offset, right, because there are multiple things that could realize the pains in question, just using our example, it still fails because it just doesn't seem like we should stop with such an anti-scientific way of understanding mental events. We should aim for a kind of generality in our theorizing. So another kind of solution, I think one that's just maybe just gestured at in the Swinburne, is this functionalism solution. So we have body events, brain events, we have mental events, mental events, obviously. On this view, the mental events are just to be defined in terms of their functions. Okay, so the mental events function is to cause certain behaviors, and then the behaviors are causally efficacious back on the mental events, which then lead to further causes. So like this kind of view is like, suppose we're to define what the nature of a pencil is. One way of going is just to define the pencil in terms of its function, namely to write on objects. Like it's just a very crude kind of example to get a sense of the functionalist view. But keep in mind that this is often taken to be a materialist solution. Okay, but it needn't be, right? Because it could be that the mental events are grounded in some kind of immaterial object. It just turns out as just a matter of fact that most functionalists, right, are contemporary functionalists anyways, are materialists. So those who develop functionalism in the 20th century into the 21st century, they tend to be materialists as well. But there's no requirement, strictly speaking. Okay, so we define mental events in terms of their functions as opposed to trying to find what entity they're identical with, okay, in the brain or elsewhere. Okay, so Swinburne just gestures at this view, so I'll just go ahead and gesture at it as well in this way, and then move on. Okay, here's another kind of solution that goes the supervenience route. So it ends up being a kind of materialist view, but one that doesn't get an identity relation between the mental events and anything physical, material, bodily, etc. Anything brain-wise. It just gets a supervenience claim that holds between the mental events and the bodily events. So we have our body events and our mental events, and just to capture the idea, we have the MEs, the mental events supervene on the brain events or the bodily events. Okay. I don't know why I put or MEs here. So I need to erase that because I think I meant or. I don't know what I meant there. So just forget this parenthetical here, if you would, please. It was a printing mistake there. On my part. So to say that the ME supervene on the BEs, what that means just is that there's no change in the mental events without a corresponding change in the brain events. So the change in the brain events is going to be the kind of thing that accounts for the change in the mental events. So this isn't an identity connection. So we're not saying that mental events just are the brain events, either type-wise or token-wise. We're just saying, take a mental event, right? Right. It's a mental item with, it's a thing that, or an object that has a property, right? A happening that has some mental property related to it, and like having a pain, right? That's going to supervene on something bodily, a bodily event, or plausibly a brain event. So there's no changes in sort of, so here I am, there's no changes in my mental events without corresponding changes in my brain events. So anytime I'm in a mental state, anytime I have a mental event, the mental event is tied to necessarily a brain event or a bodily event. Okay, more generally. So that's initially how to understand the notion of supervenience, the supervenience solution. Okay. And so this would accommodate the multiple realizability of the mental events, because the relevant body events, the brain events, could be diverse here, or could be multiple different things corresponding to the different mental events. So just the key idea, though, is just that no change in mental events without change in the brain events or the bodily events more generally. So this is a supervenience solution that's out there. Sometimes this view is called like a non-reductive materialism, because the aim isn't to try to say that the mental events just are the brain events. It's a non-reductive view because it's arguing only for the supervenience connection between the two. But given the necessary connection between the mental events and the brain events and the way the supervenience thesis works, this is still oftentimes considered, right, a materialist solution, materialist view. It just recognizes that paths can't go all the way to get the reduction, the identity claim holding between the body events and the mental events. Okay, so this idea of supervenience is initially a bit tricky. Okay. Now, and maybe another way of capturing that might be helpful before moving on is to think like about how, like, imagine like we have two, like, they're twins, right? Suppose like there's a twin Earth, there's a twin Earth where there's a twin of mine, and suppose that like we have the same bodies, right? And we have the same mental events. So the supervenience claim is holding between me and my sort of imagined twin here on twin Earth, right? So our bodies are the same, all our bodily events are the same, so all of our mental events are going to be the same. Now just suppose that like we imagine that we get to time t, right, in the stage of like my development, my twin's development, we get to a time t where it turns out that that I end up having a mental event that my twin doesn't have. So I end up being joyous, and my twin ends up being, I don't know, sad. So there's a difference in the mental events, right, that happens there, right? If like that were to happen, then what we'd have to say in order to maintain supervenience here is that there's also in us a difference in, right, the brain events or the bodily events that were associated with us. So my twin and I, even though everything had been identical, both bodily or physically and mentally up to a certain point, once there was divergence, right, in our mental lives, if I can put it that way, there had to have been also divergence in, guess what, our physical lives, our bodily lives, our brain lives, or some such, right? That's maybe another helpful way of understanding the supervenience claim. Okay. Now, some claim that the supervenience claim doesn't hold. So Swinburne would disagree with the supervenience solution, and he ends up claiming that there's no reason why, there's no powerful enough reason for thinking that the mental events, right, depend on the brain events, or that a change in someone's mental events requires a change in the bodily events, right? It's logically possible, according to Swinburne, that that someone could, if we go back to, let's actually, maybe I'll set it up this way. This might be the easiest way of setting it up. Imagine, the twin Earth example again, It's logically possible. This is just a way of I think of running Swinburne's challenge to the supervenience solution. It's logically possible for my twin and I to have the different mental to be in different mental states, to have different mental events occur. A mental event for me that involves being joyous, and for my twin to have a different mental event of being sad, right? All the while, our brain events and our bodily events remain, you've guessed it, identical, right? There's no change in them, right? So while I'm in a joyous state and my twin is in a sad state, our physical bodies, including the state of our brains, right, are identical, right? And if that's right, if this is logically possible, then the supervenience solution fails, and that's Swinburne's argument. It's like this is logically possible, so the supervenience solution fails. Okay, so long as what we've just articulated is a logical possibility, argues Swinburne, the supervenience solution fails, no matter how well it accommodates simultaneous realizability of mental events. Okay, so the last solution, the last solution, I think, this is the last solution. We began with substance dualism. We talked about substance dualism and hylomorphic dualism. We're going to conclude with a different kind of dualism, property dualism. Okay, so sorry, it's blurry here. So here we've got the human being. We have bodily events and mental events again. So BEs and MEs. The body events are grounded in material objects. So you have these material objects, and they're going to have material properties. And basically, an event, right? You think about an event, you think about that's something that occurs. What does it mean for something to occur? It means that an object underwent a change with respect to one of its properties or something like that. Or some object came into existence or went out of existence. And that's how Swinburne very generally thinks about something being an event. An event is an object gaining or losing a property or coming out of existence or going out of existence. Okay, that's an event. So a body event is just going to be an event that's related to a body. And so a body undergoing a change with respect to one of its properties, coming out of existence or going out of existence. The same thing for mental event. So a mental event is going to be an event that involves something mental, right, that undergoes a change, comes out of existence or goes out of existence. Okay, so the property dualist view maintains that there's only one kind of object, one kind of substance, as it were, one kind of thing when it comes to the kinds of objects there are, one kind of substance, namely material objects, material substances, material bodies. Okay. What mental events are, because we have mental events according to the property dualist, what they are is a mental property that's been in some sense caused by the material object, the bodily object. So the way I try to capture the property dualist view here is, as you could expect, cashing out the two different kinds of properties. So the property dualist view is a view that says that there's dualism when it comes to properties. There are physical properties and there are mental properties. And we're going to understand the mental events in terms of the mental properties. Okay. The property dualist, though, does want to claim that when it comes to the kinds of objects that exist, there's only physical substances. But there's different kinds of properties. So you can get your dualism in a different kind of way here without saying there's distinct kinds of things, right? There's distinct kinds of properties. So in a way, this is akin to the hylomorphic dualism, remember, which had it that their physical bodies, their bodies, of course, bodies are physical, but then you don't need a distinct substance in order to account for, right, the form of the body or to account for the soul or the mental event. You just need, right, the form of the body. Okay. With property dualism, the idea is similar. In order to account for mental events, you don't need a distinct immaterial substance. All you need is distinct kinds of properties, mental properties. So, so brain events, events of material objects with material properties. We know what events are now. And the mental events, events of material objects with mental properties. We know how I put your events of material objects because there are only material objects on this view in terms of material substances, despite the fact that there are two different kinds of properties that such substances can have. So material substances can have both physical properties and mental properties. That'd be another way of sort of diagramming it. It'd be something like this. You've got material objects. They can have material properties, physical properties, or they can have immaterial properties. Okay. So that's a property dualist solution. So we don't have to go all the way to, all the way to substance dualism. Maybe this view is more scientifically respectable than the substance dualist view. That's the way at least some think about things. Okay, this is the epiphenomenalist version of property dualism, which is the most common way of developing property dualism. So here, we have everything's the same with property dualism. So there's material substance, two different kinds of properties, material properties, or mental properties. I should have said immaterial properties, mental properties, okay? And here, though, what the property dualist largely claims is that there's an asymmetric causal relationship, okay, between the two. So whereas the material substance, right, the bodily events can produce mental events or can produce mental properties can't cause back on the material object. That's just what epiphenomenalism means. Epiphenomenalism really just amounts to the view that mental events are causally inefficacious. They just don't have causal powers. Mental properties don't have causal powers, right? The only things that have causal powers ultimately are the material objects, material properties. Okay, so there's an asymmetric causal interaction that holds between the two. Okay, so that's the property dualist view. So we've seen substance dualism as a traditional view, the hylomorphism view, the Aristotelian dualism view. We've seen the ancient Epicurean materialism. We've seen the Hobbesian modern materialism. Okay, and then after that, we saw the significance of the interaction problem, which gave rise to, at least in part, gave rise to idealism theories. And then we, after that, saw behaviorist theories. And then after dealing with the problems with behaviorism, we dealt with the type identity theories. The multiple realizability problem reared its ugly head for it. So then that led to the development of token identity theories. We saw that it suffered from not being generalized enough, not being properly scientific enough. And that led us to look at yet other views, the supervenience or the functionalist view, the supervenience views. We saw the challenge to the supervenience view, right? The logical possibility of my twin and I having different mental states, but having the same body states or brain states, etc. Okay. And then we concluded with the discussion of the property dualism view, okay, which culminated in this view of epiphenomenalism, okay. So a lot more work would have to be done to explain like why philosophers go epiphenomenal in this way. Part of it has to do with something that's pretty readily understandable. It has to do with the causal closure of the physical universe. So what some philosophers believe, they believe that science has established the claim that the physical universe is physically causally closed. So there can be no sort of mental events causing back on the physical. In fact, the claim is like science is ultimately going to reveal that we live in a physically closed system. So anything that's sort of mental that exists in its own right, that's a property in the case of property dualism, must be such that it's just causally inefficacious. Okay, and we'll talk more about this later in the term. I'm just kind of planting a seed here. That's one of the reasons why some philosophers might be phenomenal in this regard. Okay, you might ask, like, what led certain philosophers to go property dualist in the first place, given that it leads to this view that mental events aren't causally efficacious? Well, cases like what we'll call the Mary case did, at least in part. There are others as well, but imagine a case where Mary, she's a scientist, she's a colorblind scientist. She knows everything there is to know physically about color, but she's colorblind, and she's been, as it were, at least according to some of the formulations, she's been trapped in a room of black and white and gray her whole life. So even though she understands everything there is to know about our perceptual faculties and how our perceptual faculties and our brains, etc., relate to experiencing colors or perceiving colors, she's never actually seen a colored object. She's never seen blue. She's never seen a blue sky. She's never seen a yellow banana. She's never seen a red rose. Now imagine this color scientist, right? She's the Newton of color, of color science as it pertains to thinking about the human perceptual apparatuses. She knows all the relevant physical facts. Now suppose that one day, miraculously, she's cured of her color blindness, and she walks outside and she sees for the very first time a red rose, a blue sky, a yellow banana. Will she learn something new? And here's the thought. The intuition is supposed to be, of course, she would learn something new. She learned like what it's like to experience, right, the blue sky, the red rose, and the yellow banana. But presumably, as we already stipulated, she knew all the physical facts about perceiving colors. So in her learning something new, she learned something that was non-physical, a non-physical fact. The non-physical fact is what it's like to experience these things. The experiential quality sometimes is called of perceiving colors. Okay. And these kinds of thought experiments lead or have led some philosophers to maintain that property dualism is true, but they want to be scientific, and they want to claim that science has established a causal closure of the physical. So they go on to say things like, you got to learn to love the epiphenomenal, because these cases, they're intuitive, they seem exactly right, they seem to generate the truth that there are non-physical facts. Okay, but we have to be scientifically respectable as well. Okay, so that concludes today's discussion. We'll talk more about the metaphysics of the mind next week. I'll take stock of the reading to see where we're at, to see if we need to stay in chapter 2 longer. I think we will, because I don't think I got about 2/3 of the way or more through, and then we'll perhaps be able to segue to chapter 3. So I'll keep you posted on that. I wish you all well. Hope you have a great night, and I'll see you all next time. I'm gonna stop sharing. Again, take care. Bye-bye.